excited to be back out on the field this week. It really doesn't seem like it's been that long. I think now our summers just kind of roll through. When the last game ends and you get into the portal, you get into finishing up recruiting, the draft, maybe try to fit a quick vacation in, and boom, it's here. But it's exciting to get everybody on the field at one time. The guys have been on campus now for a little over a month. We've been doing the 4-on-1s or skill work, however you would like to phrase it, over the last four weeks. And so we've been quite busy. Congratulations to Carl Lafferty, another outstanding recruiting class, number 4 ranked recruiting class in the country. As you guys know, that's the high school kids. But I think, also, a great job with the portal and winning the draft, which I'll kind of elaborate on in just a minute. But a number 4 ranked recruiting class, outstanding young guys coming into the program, and some that we think will impact the program immediately as freshmen. Some of the higher ranked guys, obviously Owen Pano, shortstop out of New York, and he's been terrific. Hayden Federico, on the mound, Cade Townsend, Owen Hancock, Caden Lopez, some of the higher ranked pitchers, but plentiful. I think there's 16 total in that recruiting class. The portal was a little different for us this summer, and I think we all, one of the things is as we go further and further, the difference in the portal is how you use it, and do you go obviously after your distinct needs, and I thought we did that, and I thought the coaches, including Joel, was a big part of that, and so we knew that we wanted to get a defensive shortstop in the portal, and we signed Luke Chang out of Illinois State. And we needed some catching depth, obviously, and so signed 2 catchers out of the portal: Colin Reuter from BYU and Austin Foley from the University of Kentucky, and then an old outfield. We needed to replace the entire outfield, but also replace some pieces in the lineup, and thought we did a great job with some really older guys, different. In the sense that we risked some for the reward. Went after guys that were possible draft picks in June, but guys that we thought would impact the program immediately with their bat in the outfield. And so you look at Ryan Moorman, hit 19 home runs for the University of Illinois last year. Mitch Sanford, who comes to us as a Sun Belt Conference Player of the Year, but was at LSU prior to that. And then Isaac Humphrey, that was a 3-year starter for the University of Louisville. And so and then along with that, we signed Will McCausland from St. Joe's, Alex Canny from the University of Tampa, who won the Division II World Series. But then maybe the best recruits are sometimes keeping your recruits. And so to win the draft with 4 guys on the mound, that probably at the end of the year when I last saw you, we didn't think we'd have this year. And so Hunter Elliott is back healthy. We'll throw an inter-squad game on Sunday. Looks great. It's been terrific. Riley Maddox turns down the draft and comes back for his senior year along with Mason Nichols. And so what's neat about those 3 guys are all 3 Mississippi guys, all 3 guys that were in that dog pile, right behind us on the wall. So all 3 of them own a national championship ring. And not to mention Connor Spencer, another guy that we didn't think would return, had a really good year last year as our closer, and unfortunately, probably didn't get the accolades and wasn't in that position enough to get the accolades, but, feel that'll be different. So excited to see him all together. We've watched him for a month, some pitcher versus hitter, but mostly in drill work and, a lot of fundamentals, but to start this weekend with inter-squad games, it's an exciting time to, especially if you're a baseball fan, to kind of see some of those new guys, not to mention, the guys returning. So with that, I'll open it for questions.
Mike, I know that you haven't had a pitching coach for a lot of your time here. What made you want to hire one, and why Joel specifically?
two different things that I think stick out. One, I even though I thought we pitched better last year than the year before, we have to pitch better if we want to compete in our league. And I thought it was time to hand over the reins to somebody else. But with that, going further, I thought I wasn't as good. Not just from the mound standpoint, but overall. I think personally, one of the things that I do best is manage the program. And pitching's changed, and things change over time. I look back, really probably middle to end of last year. One of the things that popped out to me was how many pitchers we had. We had 19 pitchers last year that had numbers, meaning stats, guys that actually threw in a game. I want to say, if I remember right, my first year here, we had 12. So that's 1/3 more, at least 1/3 more pitchers. And so it's not just 1/3 more pitchers getting stats, it's 1/3 more bullpens, it's 1/3 more meetings, it's 1/3 more development, and so on. And most pitching staffs in the SEC hold over 20 pitchers on their roster, pitch around 19, 20, maybe 21 guys, throughout the season. And not to mention the volume of just from analytics to video and things that are at your fingertips that we didn't have 20 plus years ago. And so I think it's just pulled me away from the program more because as the head coach, there's other duties. You got to figure out who's going to be the starting shortstop. You got to figure out who's going to bat leadoff and those types of things. And so I thought all things pointed to that I needed to make a change. But then specifically Joel, which again we're stealing that thunder a little bit, but why not do it right now? There's a lot of people that I was going to say my surprise. That's not, I think, the right words. I think to my pleasure that there was so many guys that applied for the job. I talked to and interviewed on the phone major league pitching coaches that are wearing a big league uniform right now and they're trying to make it to the playoffs. Assistant, pitching coaches in the big leagues, minor league pitching coaches. Current Division I coaches, but I really wanted somebody from professional baseball. And the reason for that is because of the technology, because of the analytics. Professional baseball, like a lot of times, are a little ahead of us, especially at the higher levels of professional baseball, because they have the money to be able to invest in technology and equipment faster than us. Now, we're part of the haves in college baseball, so we have a lot of those toys and things at our disposal as well. But I wanted somebody that was schooled and knew about that. I wanted somebody that was a great developer. But I also wanted somebody that was from college. I mean, that was important to me, that they understood our game. And what I mean by that is that they realized that we need that development to happen sooner than later. They need to develop now so they can help us win in February, not in 5 years from now. And so that was important. And also to realize that it's not just about pitching development. It's about recruiting. It's about developing young people. Most of these guys aren't going to pitch in the big leagues, right? And so somebody's got to understand that role as well. And so Joel checked all the boxes and was terrific. And super excited that he's here, and probably one of the best hires we've ever made here in the program.
Like, when did Hunter get kind of, as you said, healthy, but when he kind of get cleared over the summer?
I think probably the throwing protocol was probably somewhat done in August, early August, but it's kind of rolls into these live BPs and then into. But he's been, some of that I think is splitting hairs because his throwing protocol kind of adapted over time because he's taken, as you know, some pauses. Sometimes you have hiccups in that. So it's a long process on, coming back from Tommy John, but then also he had a couple hiccups, to where, usually because of the long process, they say, okay, put it down for a couple weeks and let's do this. And then you have to start to ramp back up. So he's had a couple of those, nothing that was, injury, but he didn't feel great, or it was a little stiff, or it was this or that. So his his rehab process was much longer than most guys, and so when he's gotten to this point of July into August, there was no really reservations from the doctors or anybody that said that he couldn't go. Obviously, we stayed on pace, and now it's just ramping him up to kind of train him. I think one of the things, and Joe may talk about, is getting him to be able to compete now. And so you don't want the first time for him to really compete in over 2 years is on, February 15th. Be able to compete out here in the inter-squad games, feel good about yourself. Be careful of how you judge success. It's not just in a velocity number. It's not, it's in a lot of different things. I think it's in his command and in his bounce back from starts, all these different things, all these boxes that I know Coach Mangrum and him will be looking at throughout the fall. So he'll be ready and feel really good shutting down at the end of the fall and then ramping back up into the springtime.
Just going back to recruiting, I guess maybe more so the transfer portal, how did you see your returning players kind of play a role in that?
Yeah, terrific. The guys, it's different. It's different, and culture's probably talked a lot about now more than ever in the last few years, and leadership and teamsmanship. We've always felt strong about our culture, but that's something that you can lose quickly. And I'm proud of the way that our guys have acted this summer and responded, after last year. And again, I think getting some older guys in the portal, which is a little unusual. Usually you're going after the guy that had the really good freshman year, but we signed some older guys and some guys that have been around, some guys that have been around successful programs, some guys that have had success, at this level in Power 5 conferences, and they came here for a reason, and that's made it a lot better. But guys like Luke Hill, guys like Will Furness, Campbell Smithwick, and others, not to mention the 4 pitchers. I think we're an integral part, not just recruiting guys to our program, but making them feel very comfortable, because we're all in this together. And how much success you're going to have individually a lot of times depends on how much success the others are going to have.
Free time might not be the right word, but with having a pitching coach on staff now, what are the areas, the places you feel like you've gotten to devote extra time to?
I think you're right. I've gotten a lot of free time. So I've been to the beach 3 times since the school started, and I got a vacation set up for London next week. And no, I'm teasing. It's a great question, and some of that I feel busier than I've ever been. So I don't feel that free time, but I get the question. And some of the things is, I think, me trying to find my niche as well. We've even talked about, Joel, like I said to Coach Mangrum, I said, I'm going to try to stay away, from the pen. And he goes, no, I'd rather you not. Because I'd rather you be there as much as possible, as much as time permits for you. And I know you got to go be with the position players, but I think that's good that they see me with you and interacting. But make no mistake about it, this is his gig. He coaches the pitchers. We talk about it, but I don't talk to him any more about the pitchers than I would talk to Mike Clement about the hitters. I think more as a CEO and overseeing it, and less as and sharing advice and sharing things and sharing, hopefully, my experiences over 30 plus years of coaching. But he's doing it from day to day. He's the one that's walking in and say, hey, this is who I got set up to pitch in Friday's inter-squad. This is how many innings they're going to pitch, and so on. So, but it's been good. I've enjoyed being with the infielders, a lot more, which I used to do. I used to do the pitchers and work with the infielders and outfielders and catchers. But to be able to see them, what I've realized over the last probably couple of years is I won't see the infielders do their defensive portion. I miss the catchers a lot. And these are things that, some of the things I really enjoyed about when becoming a coach way prior to being a head coach, but did it as a head coach, but haven't done it as much, of late. And again, I think that's affected things, and not to mention just the CEO part, being more involved with, what's going on from tickets and marketing, and guys that have sat, some of these guys sitting in the seats know that that's who I am. It's how we run the program, that those things are important. And, I think I've been more detached from that the last few years. So hopefully, a little more available for people.
You mentioned it with Luke Chang specifically, but when putting together this roster, how important was the defensive emphasis?
Without a doubt, last year was one of our poorest, years defensively, I thought, and I don't even know statistically, but I just didn't feel that we caught it as well as we should, especially at those key positions, in the middle, behind the plate, and some of that I think is newness, was newness to Hill and Randall and others, and some of it's personnel. And so, we did it with a lot of new guys last year in some key, positions. So if you look at mostly Hill and Randall, and then, Campbell behind the plate, as tough a year as, maybe for a few of those guys defensively it may have been. And it's not that it was awful statistically for any one guy, but I think collectively we weren't good, especially in those key positions, that sometimes pays off dividends in the future. Where those I've always said that this league will make you grow up in a hurry, right? And so the fortunate part about it is those guys got to be out there, in the heat of the battle and play. And I think a lot of times that pays dividends. It's sometimes tougher, when you're going through it, a little painful, but it pays dividends. But the question was, the need for those replacements and be able to have some depth, and it was really to add depth, to put some competition there, put some competition behind home plate, put some competition in the middle, not to mention some of the young, outstanding freshmen. We signed 3 high school shortstops, so.
One of your most talented pitchers, Austin Simmons, he's, obviously in the middle of football season. What have you kind of, did you see those first 2 weeks of him throwing the ball, and in the spring, do you expect him to be on this roster still?
Yeah. I hope this comes across the right way, is, they've had so much success over there the last 3 weeks, where the games, and I can say this because I'm not the football coach, the games have, gotten a little out of hand, a little boring, maybe for the typical fan, but I'm waiting for Simmons to get in there, right? So like when everybody else is thinking about when's the chance for their exit, I'm waiting to, see when he's going to run in there. And so just happy for him. I've heard and don't know much about football and haven't watched a football practice, but I've heard from Coach Kiffin and all the people that do know about football how talented he really is. So to see him run out there a few times and watch him do that is pretty special, because we know what he can do out here and how special he is here. And so I'm just happy and proud for him. As far as here, we've talked about it, obviously, the injury, and he looks healthy, but throwing a baseball is different than throwing a football. And I think the best thing is for him to be the best version of himself on the football field right now, get through that, and then we'll tackle baseball when it comes, because, I think it's more complicated than just, are you good enough to play here? Are you healthy enough to play here? What's the football, look like, as you're fighting to be the number one, and all the things that you guys already know. So to say that after 3 weeks of non-conference football is probably a little inappropriate.